Okay, everyone, welcome back. Thank you for coming back. This is great. Love to see all of you. Just so you know, we have more than 100 people who joined us online this morning as well to watch this. So we're grateful for the good size audience and grateful that you're all still here. Again, we have another 3 sessions this afternoon. We'll get right into it. Talking about organizational responsibility. And our moderators for this are Skeet, who's our Senior Director of Leadership and Business Ethics, and Dr. Brian Green, who's our Director of Technology Ethics, and they will introduce their panel and their panelists. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Thor. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Okay, wonderful. So as Thor said, I'm Skeet, and I've been at the Markkula Center for 11 years, and along with Brian, co-authored a book about technology ethics, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we covered in that book around organizations' responsibilities to get AI right and to be thinking about some of the issues that we talked about this morning. So I'm going to ask our panelists actually to self-introduce themselves, just tell us a little bit about their background, and we'll just go right down the row. I do want to point out that we have a pinch hitter today. So you have to be careful if you come to a conference like this, because you might get asked to sit on a panel at the last minute. One of our panelists let us know this morning that she was too ill to participate, but fortunately we had a good friend in the audience in Tracy, Pizzo, Frey, and she is joining us today, and we're very grateful to you for being willing to jump in and share your wisdom with us, so thank you very much for that. All right, and also thank you to Daniel and to Benjamin, who've had a little bit more time to think about the topic at hand, and we're so grateful
Unfair
for
advantage.
your participation. Go ahead.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Brian, and the rest of the Markkula Center for inviting us and organizing this event. It's an important conversation. And I am a senior director at Salesforce in the Futures team. We sit in the office of the CEO advising our chief executive on what might happen in the future. We like to anticipate, imagine, and shape the future. And one of the tasks that I get to do as well as at Salesforce is be part of the an advisor to the Office of Ethical and Humane Use, in which we think about how we develop and design our technologies. I'm a trained physicist. When public policy worked in the White House under the Clinton administration in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I was lucky to work with Brian and Anne when I became a fellow at the World Economic Forum working on AI, ethics, and responsible tech. So I get to spend all my time now thinking about AI ethics at Salesforce and how we can develop technologies that will be positive for the future of our society. So I'm glad to be here.
Great, thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Benjamin Larsen, and I'm an AI lead with the World Economic Forum. And at the World Economic Forum, we have an initiative called the AI Governance Alliance. And with the AI Governance Alliance, we have about 600 or so stakeholders, 600 members who are working with us on tackling some of the most frontier and most critical issues in AI governance today. So we're cutting across a number of different fields here. We're talking about the technology. We're talking about different areas of application across sectors, across industries. We're talking about policy. We're talking about regulation. We're also talking about energy, and we're talking about what is international collaboration, what does it look like in this space. And that's why I think it's so critical that we're having this conversation as well, because underpinning everything that we do is really this multi-stakeholder approach towards how can we come to agree on such a transformative technology, what kind of impact is it going to have on our lives going forward. And I think the only way to really determining that is to have a multi-stakeholder collaboration on this, involving all voices of society from across civil society, from academia, from the public sector, from the private sector, to really figure out and have a meaningful discussion and conversation with this technology and how it's going to touch our lives. What can we agree on? What can we disagree on? And how can we advance best practices together, essentially? So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation here today. And thanks so much, Anne and Brian, for the invitation. Thank you.
So I am Tracy Pizzo Frey. I currently operate my own consulting company, which I laugh at really because I just own the domain. I don't actually have a company called Restorative AI. And at the moment, my sole client actually is Common Sense Media. So for the last 2 years, I've been working with them to develop and conduct risk assessments for AI tools that impact kids and education. Prior to that work and what really informs it, I spent 11 years at Google. The last 5 of those, I started and ran all of our responsible AI work for Google Cloud as the managing director of outbound product management and responsible AI. Got to work very closely with Shannon Valor, which is actually how I know these folks here. So have a pretty interesting now perspective on what this work is like from within industry and within a major player in this space, and what this work is like from within a nonprofit advocacy organization, and how those interact. So happy to join in on the party today. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Brian Green. I'm the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center. As Ann noted earlier, we together wrote the book called Ethics in the Age of Disruptive Technologies, an Operational Roadmap. So we've been thinking a lot about how ethics works in organizations. And one of the ways I really got introduced to that was by working with Daniel Lim, because Daniel and I co-authored several reports together, one on Microsoft, one on IBM, one on Salesforce, on what they were doing in terms of basically how do you incorporate ethics into your organization. And so at that point, this was back in 2021 and 2022. That it was a time of great optimism for tech ethics, I would say. Now that I look back on it, maybe it was the high water mark, because I think that shortly after that things started deteriorating, and they're continuing kind of downwards right now in some ways. So I'm really looking forward to this panel, because I think this will be a chance for us to dig in and see what's going on from all their perspectives.
Great.
And back to you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to pose some questions here to the panel, and then Brian's going to sort of drive when we get to the part where we get your questions at the end. We'll try and leave about 15 minutes for that part of the discussion. I wanted to just set the stage a little bit for why this is a pressing topic right now. KPMG released a survey last week that was reported in the Wall Street Journal that had some really kind of alarming statistics in it. 44% of the people who responded reported unauthorized uses of artificial intelligence in their organization. 46% copped to actually uploading proprietary company information and intellectual property into public AI systems. 58% said that they had actually used AI to complete their work, but hadn't had enough time to check the outcomes. And 53% admitted to allowing people to believe that work that AI had done was actually their own work. And in spite of those numbers, 70% of them said that they felt optimistic and were looking forward to the benefits of artificial intelligence. So some of that dichotomy that's present in the world is present in those numbers as well. So with that as a backdrop, I thought I would just start by asking each of you to talk about what you see as, how do you think of organizational responsibility, and what does responsible AI mean to you? And to get us started, we'll just kind of go down in order. So Daniel, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to answer that in 2 ways. The first is more from an academic standpoint, or in a way that you could apply this to multiple organizations. It's based on the Ethics by Design paper that we co-authored together while I was at the World Economic Forum. And in that, we were inspired by Daniel Kahneman and some of his work and how you think fast, think slow, and how incentives really play a big role in how people behave. And we deconstructed that into a framework in which we thought about 3 areas of focus for organizations to drive more ethical behavior through intentional design of the organization. It starts with really attention, right? As you are doing your work and as you're designing and using technologies, you need to be attentive to the implications of some of that technology, right? I think earlier today, I think that there was a lot of talk about the implications of the technology. Well, it starts with somebody who's really thinking about it and thinking from an ethical perspective, what might the use and the development of the technology do to the various influences that they may have, right? The second is control. And this point is that we all look at things in different ways. As I'm speaking here, you may interpret it in a different way. But in an organization, you really need to look at a certain situation with a specific norm that will be driven by the values of the organization, so that you're in agreement on how to deal with some of those issues that arise. So how you construe, how you interpret those situations really matter. The third one is motivation, right? We're all incentivized by various forces that drive the way we behave. In organizations, things like compensations, cultural norms, and external factors that are outside the organizations, all of that motivate the way we behave. So if you can think about designing systems that are driving more ethical behaviors, whether those are related to performance evaluations, as well as the way that the technology is progressing, then there's a way to measure and motivate people in a more ethical way. So that's from a more, I think, a more abstract perspective. From a Salesforce perspective, we look at this and really some key principles, right? At the very top, our company value is trust. So a lot of that drives almost all the motivations we have at our company, right? As a technology company, we sell our technology to other entities, whether it's Markkula Center, SCU, or other corporations to use it. So they're governed by that system, and we have to be fully understanding of the ecosystem we live in. And with that, our customers need to trust that we are responsible with the technology, with the data that they're imbuing on our technologies, right? And we have designed our entire ecosystem based on that idea of trust, right? Imagine 23 years ago when Salesforce was started, the idea of putting all your data on the cloud, especially your customer data on the cloud, is a far-fetched idea. But we had to build the trust with organizations, with our customers, to say, hey, you know what? This is where the world is going. And this is something that we own our responsibility. In fact, we have a shared responsibility on how to build trust together and how we use the technology and how the data is used, right? And over time, we've obviously shown that that's possible, and this ecosystem has thrived. So I'll pause there, and we'd love to hear other thoughts.
Yeah, so the way I see it and the way that I would approach it, I would like to break it down into, you have the technical aspects, and then you have the socio-technical or the organizational aspects. And I think when we look at how technology is developed today, it's very clear that most consumer-facing technology, most technology out there is not developed outside of an organizational context. So when we look at the technology that we're developing, we can assess for what are the technical specificities of an AI program, of a system, that it's optimized in terms of it being non-biased, in terms of it being fair, in terms of how the technical dimensions of the program itself is structured. But all of that is also configured within the organizational context that essentially sets the rules for at the developmental process and before we ship a product, before it's being adopted out there in the ecosystem, in the market, etc., that we have organizational structures in place that demand that the team of engineers, the developers, works together with, it could be in-house research scientists, etc., that you essentially probe not only the technical dimensions of the systems, but that you also, in an organizational and a governance context, figure out what does it look like when this system, as it moves from the team of 12 or 100 engineers, however it may be, who's developing the system, into its actual context in terms of where it's being potentially downstream adopted. And then you can, from an organizational perspective, you can have a team that then probes the system and looks at, okay, how do end users react with the system? What are the implications of that? You can begin to look at, okay, what are the values of the system itself if we believe that this is the downstream community of adopters, essentially. how does that impact the end user? And then you can begin to have that as an organizational approach, as an organizational structure that is codified into these are the actual steps that we have to take as an organization, moving from innovation, moving from development of the system itself before it's being deployed into the market, into a given socioeconomic context. You can test and optimize for a range of parameters, but of course that has to be codified within the organization, that this is the approach that we have chosen to essentially probe and test the system for. And to me, and that would be one recipe for what is an organizational approach to essentially responsible AI, what can or might that look like?
Okay, so I'm going to, I think I'm probably going to be the controversial one on this panel in general, and say that actually organizations have no responsibility when it comes to responsible AI as it is today. And if you step back at this and look at it from a systems perspective, what I mean by that, or a systematic perspective, is that companies are responsible, and I'm thinking of for-profit companies here. For-profit companies are responsible to either their funders, if they're startups, or they're responsible to their shareholders. So they're responsible for growth, they're responsible for return. That's ultimately what their requirements are. Should they have responsible AI as a part of what it means to grow in the best possible way? Absolutely, yes, but there's no requirement to do that. And there are no laws. The only sweeping law right now is the EU AI Act, which is just coming into force. Other than that, there are no requirements for how they operate or behave or transparency or anything. So I think it's important to recognize that, because that is a lot of, then you see an enormous variety of not only what companies put out into the world, but how that changes over time depending on the pressures on their internal priorities to the responsibilities they have to their shareholders, funders, et cetera. Now, I fundamentally believe that responsible AI is inseparable from the success of AI. And in part, I think that's in large part because of that question of trust, because you need trust at every step of an organization's value chain. And without that, you hinder growth, and I think you hinder innovation. So, from my standpoint, it's crucial and critical. And I think if I think about what it means for responsible AI from within an organization, I think there's a few components that are really important. And clearly, this comes a lot from my own personal experience here, but I think it's very important for an organization to state very clearly what its values are, because otherwise you have a lot of ideally very well-meaning people who are deciding for themselves what is right and ethical and responsible, and they don't have sort of a guiding set of ideas of what they are striving for. That alone is not enough. I think you then need to have very clear processes that everybody agrees that they will not deviate from. Doesn't mean those processes can't change, but those have to be the things that people fall back on to say, this is how we are going to pressure test our work against this set of value statements, honoring that complexity of human dignity and individuals, and that there's no right answer here. There are just a lot of things that need to come in to the picture in order to then decide what to do about that. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find, say, a product manager or a set of engineers who would say that they shouldn't understand their users at this point. I think that's a given. But you would probably also be hard-pressed to find a product manager or engineer or decider in an organization that said they should understand the full societal landscape of how that product will interact with the world, who it might affect in ways that are unintended, could cause foreseeable or unknown harms, that feels too much outside the scope of responsibility. And that's where I also fundamentally disagree. I think you need all of that input, or as much of it as you can get, in order to make the very best possible decisions for a product, for what responsible AI looks like. It doesn't mean that you are solving systemic racism with one product, because you can't do that, but it does mean that you understand what your product could do and how it could be the most beneficial for the most people, and that will lead to greater success, ultimately growth, revenue, all the good things that companies want. So,
Great. Thank you all. So a couple of you have touched on this very important aspect of the common good, this notion of trust. And so there have been some fairly high-profile examples where that trust has been broken, where things have gone wrong with artificial intelligence. So I'm just wondering, would like to hear from a few of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Tracy, and work our way back this way this time, about what we can learn from those moments where we've had some missteps and some things have gone wrong.
yeah. There's a very one that's top of mind for me, and I'll just preface it by saying I think, particularly when you're talking about AI that is about humans and for humans, so as opposed to, say, something like climate technology, obviously that's about humans too, but that it depends on human data. Right? It depends on all these little bits of humanity in order to function in any way, shape, or form. So just to hold that in mind. Yesterday at Common Sense Media, we released what has been, I have done hundreds of responsible AI assessments across almost every industry and use case you can imagine. This was the hardest, the most heartbreaking, jaw-dropping, brutal assessment work I've ever done, and it was on social AI companions and the impacts to teens. It is awful. Truly, truly terrible. It was, I knew it would be bad. I thought it would be difficult to get these companions, whether or not they are supposed to be used by teens. We all know they are, and there are some that are available to them. To do bad things. It was not difficult at all to get them to suggest harming others, harming parents, running away from home, how to obtain drugs, alcohol, weapons, make napalm, engage in extremely inappropriate sexual role play, willing to engage in sexual role play with underage boys. Just terrible things. So much so that we are saying very clearly that these are just not safe for people under 18, but they are very profitable. This is a huge revenue opportunity for these organizations. Maybe even more so than a lot of the other uses. And by the way, this is the second most popular use case of ChatGPT. It's harder to make it do these things, but it's certainly possible. And when you have a companion that is always available, doesn't matter what you say to it, it's always there for you, it reduces all of that, as Shannon has put it, friction in human relationships that are inherently messy. For younger teens and anyone with who is more vulnerable, this becomes unbelievably attractive, much more so than their own human world. So that is, I think, just an extraordinary failure, which we've already seen people take their own lives and teens take their own lives because companions told them to do so. So, and right now, not a lot's being done.
Benjamin?
Yeah, so I'd maybe go into the example of hiring algorithms, and I think it's clear now that there's this swarm of applications, sometimes completely automated, and it can be, as an employer, it can be very hard to look through the stack of applications. Hence, there's a rationale for, of course, engaging in using algorithms to essentially look through this stack of applicants. But what happens in that process, of course, is that if you have a biased hiring algorithm that is skewed in one way or the other, then you don't have a fair assessment. And I think in this hiring process, nobody they want to be excluded based on attributes that are essentially just a reproduction of systemic issues across society that can easily be baked into an algorithm knowingly and unknowingly. And I think that's exactly the issue. So putting a bit of onus on, well, what do we do in those situations where it's so critical? If you have an algorithmic tool that's essentially making downstream decisions that can affect your kind of future opportunities and so on, you better make sure that these are not reflective of some of the existing kind of systemic biases that exist in society. And I think maybe to your point, Tracy, in terms of you mentioned the EU AI Act, of course, and then pointed to this notion that not a whole lot is being done elsewhere in terms of local regulation and legislation. But on this particular topic, there was a local law 144 in New York City that put the onus on, if you're using an algorithmic hiring tool, then you have to demonstrate this tool is essentially non-biased, and you have to be open and transparent in terms of how it's put together. Whether the law is effective or not, and it's also been subject to a lot of criticism, but I think it points in an important direction, and that is that whenever we have some of these systems that have downstream implications for that are a part of determining our future, especially in critical areas such as hiring, I think there has to be an onus put on the adopter, sometimes also on the developer of these systems, to ensure that they don't reproduce any of these systemic biases, as I mentioned. So I think that's an important example, and I think the local law 114 was an important kind of step in that direction towards figuring out, okay, how do we enable oversight and transparency in some of these system-critical functionalities.
Yeah, to your question, Anne, I think the one area is where I've more recently seen the failures in the AI systems is the ability for its behaviors to tend to be sycophantic. So trying to please the user in a way or that perhaps is inappropriate and may lead to some of the tragic incidences that you're describing there, Tracy, and that if the user really doesn't know right from wrong, is willing to have a conversation with an AI system, then if it's just willing to please that human being, then it could take them in various places, right? So that's something that's been there in these systems for some time. For some reason, the tuning of the algorithms and the models have created greater risk in the more recently released models. So I think that's one of the key things that I've seen that's been challenging. One thing I will bring up, though, is having worked in government, the legal framework or the legal system will always fall behind the development of technologies. In the history of time, that's always been the case. So it does put some responsibility on, to your point, Benjamin, the creators of the technology as the users of the technology to use it responsibly, right? And that's why I think when we've drafted the paper on ethics by design, it really can be applied to human beings as well as organizations, because at the end of the day, you can't just rely on the law. It's not going to happen in time for how quickly the world is changing today. So, I think there's a rich conversation to be had on how you do that in such a powerful technology, right? But I think that, I'll end with this, is that there are positive parts in the use of the technology as well, right? It requires, at the end of the day, the technology is a tool. So those who really know how to use it and use it for good, there's some positive aspects. I'll give you an example. I went to the MIT Media Lab a couple of years ago, met with some of my friends who now work in a company called Common Fusion Systems. It's the way that they're trying to develop fusion energy. If they're able to create fusion energy, it could really solve some of our challenges around climate change and our dependency on fossil fuels. The only way they can keep that fusion core reactor to be generating net positive energy is to use AI to point the lasers, to make the calculations in time so that it's pointing the lasers at the right point at the right time, right? So they've proven that that technology has been able to create net energy using these techniques. So we got to think about how do we apply the technology, perhaps in places that is showing promise while mitigating the risk.
Great, thanks. Those are all pretty powerful examples. I want to go back to the one, Daniel, that you just shared about sycophancy. That caused OpenAI just, I think, this week to call back a version of ChatGPT because of these characteristics. So let's talk a little bit about what companies are doing to vet products before they're being launched, and maybe how that's changed over time or how it should change. So I don't know if you have some insights as to how Salesforce approaches that, but maybe we could start from just learning from their approach.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Obviously, we start with the principles, to your point, Tracy. Having really clear values that we all share, that's fully vetted and well chosen. We take a lot of pride and a lot of effort in choosing the words we put in our principles. So it starts with being responsible and is driven by our guidance towards protecting human rights. Second is accountable, right? Whatever we do, we own it. Now, we work with our customers, so in some cases, we share the responsibility and we negotiate that with our customers. Third is being transparent. So we explain what our technology is doing and are open about what it can and can't do and what it should be doing. Then the fourth is empowering, right? This idea of human dignity, I think we don't use that word within Salesforce because I think we think about there's agency in how you create dignity, right? How you live your life. So using the word empowering is a way for us to kind of get at that in which we are empowering you to create the life you want to live, right? Through technology and as one of the tools. And lastly is being inclusive, right? Being inclusive of all of gender, races, and so on. And in terms of how we put this into practice, it really starts with, if we can build this technology, the first question is, should we, right? Now, as a trained scientist, as a physicist, I would say there's a difference between basic science and product creation. I use an analogy of nuclear physics as we actually want to learn everything about nuclear science. Because as a society, it would help us figure out where we came from and the basic sciences around all the bits and bobs and all the physical things that are around us. But how you deploy nuclear technology into the uses is the key question, right? And that's true for AI as well. We actually want to know everything about what AI is capable of, but how you deploy it in the areas you deploy it, you got to be very careful, right? So that first question about should you do it, should you create the product based on what you know about what's possible, that's the first question. The second is, to Tracy's point, is when we're creating technology, we're always testing in small increments to see and think about the ethical and the risks, right? And we're doing it in concert with our stakeholders, right? We have an ethical use council that we bring in human rights experts. We have we work with the World Economic Forum, have multiple stakeholders kind of have these conversations to figure out whether we should do this or not. So we're not doing this within ourselves, we're doing it with the community in which we serve. The last part is that as we are creating these technologies, we have a responsibility to educate the users, right? When we create it, we kind of know what it is capable of, so we have to tell our customers and those who are using the technology, well, this is the best way of using it. In fact, we have very specific rules about what you're allowed to do with that technology and what you're not allowed to do. And then what are areas where it should be used for and what it shouldn't be used for. And, one of the things I could say that, early on, Salesforce, we deployed our technology and we found out that ICE, the Border Patrol, was using our technology and our employees really just revolted. That's what led to the formation of our Ethical Use Council and our Office of Ethical and Humane Use today, because we felt like that was not the best use of our technology, again, towards our values, right? So you can see how that plays out where, the empowering, even our employees can really push back on how the entire corporation is serving individuals and our society and our customers. And that kind of the full cycle is the way we look at it.
So Tracy, you've seen it from both sides. Right now you're reviewing products after they've been launched, but I know you've had some work at Google and in your overall history where you're looking at products before they get launched. So what's changed? What's important in that process?
Yeah. So I'll come at this from inside a place like Google first. So I think there are really sort of two things. There's the most common thing that happens in organizations, which is they particularly if they're not building AI themselves and they're working to implement it. They do a gazillion proof of concepts and then decide, okay, yeah, we want to do this, and then right before they put something into production or deploy it or integrate it into some other environment, there comes a moment where everyone goes, oh, wait a second, have we actually looked at this and checked whether it's might cause unfair bias or things like that, right? Now it's great if anyone says that, that's too late. Because this isn't something you can kind of tack on at the end. It's better than nothing, but I would say that's the most common thing that happens from a testing perspective. But that's also very then costly and time consuming then because you have to go back, right? Delays, all the things. Ideally what happens is that this is done by design at the very, very beginning where there's an assessment of not only the use case, the business opportunities, who the most likely users are, who your target users are perhaps, but that societal landscape and understanding of what does this interact with in the world. Who does it interact with? What are the systems it interacts with? What are the places where there could be harms introduced that we could foresee now, that we could work to mitigate? And there are a number of things that can and should happen at that point before even anyone puts fingers on a keyboard. And I would say that crucially here is understanding that the phrase of nothing about us without us, which is something that Daniel was touching on, right? So it's not, it does not work well to have a group of, I'll just be blunt, privileged white people making decisions on their own about products that are impacting, say, Black people in healthcare. We know what happens in that kind of situation. And so ensuring that you have a way, a mechanism, the ability to incorporate as much of the full range of the human experience as possible and lived experience and understanding that you cannot know those things, I cannot know those things, is incredibly important to getting it as right as possible. And then, there's all kinds of testing that happens along the way. But then there needs to be more after it's deployed and integrated, and understanding of not only how the technology it might change. There's drift, there's all kinds of other things that can happen with machine learning technology in particular, but also how society might be changing and those needs and what do you then do to go back and assess that. And I'll just give a quick example here that is actually personal. So before I was with Google Cloud, I was with Google for Education, and every K-12 district that we spoke to around the country, this is more in the US, said, this is before machine learning was a real big thing, they said, we want a student risk model. We need to understand what students are at risk in our, in a classroom, in our schools, what schools are at risk, what teachers might be at risk, should have been a red flag, wasn't. And we have 4 data sets. We have attendance, grades, behavior, and test scores. They don't talk to each other. We need them to talk to each other. I thought this was a great idea. Sounds great. Going to help students, right? And I pushed for it really hard. Luckily, it never hit the top of the priority list because once I started doing the responsible AI work, I realized how awful that could have been because there's a lot that's invisible to that data that they have. If you don't know if a student is coming to school hungry, which we know empirically means they cannot perform as well in school, If you don't know whether a student is exposed to violence or trauma in their home or community, which we know empirically means they cannot perform as well, then they are going to end up being labeled as high risk. And guess what? Who is that going to impact the most in the US? Black and brown kids. And these get tied into disciplinary systems. So these are things that if you don't think about them ahead of time, you could be causing to happen in ways that you really didn't intend.
Great, thanks. Benjamin? Sorry.
Yeah, so at the World Economic Forum, I mentioned we have this initiative on the AI Governance Alliance where we have more than 600 partners. So I think how we approach this is, again, in this multi-stakeholder fashion. And I want to mention these 3 waves of AI governance that we currently are going through. One is general AI, so AI systems that have existed for a very long time. And I think going back to your point, Daniel, at the base layer, we have, well, what are the principles at which we go about judging a given system? And of course, here we have well-known system principles such as fairness and bias and transparency, explainability, etc. So I think that is the first wave that we have then since been building on top of when it comes to AI governance specifically. The second wave, of course, is much shorter, but that is generative AI. And here we're building on top of everything that we've learned in the first wave when it comes to organizational governance and what best practices they look like, by then trying to assess, well, when we have a generative AI systems, what are some of the new ways in which we have to assess and test for these systems? And I think what you mentioned, sycophancy and so on, are entirely new concepts, but then build both up and down from this first level these first principles that we go about judging and assessing a system by. Now, the third wave, which is currently emerging, and that is linked to AI agents. So you have general AI, you have generative AI, and now you have a layer on top of that, which is agentic AI, essentially. And again, we have to build down the stack in terms of, okay, so we have an agentic system. It means that it has autonomy to act in various settings. And this autonomy, it can be either in a highly critical function, and it can have several degrees of freedom to interact. It can have multiple interactions. And where in this process do we have human oversight? Bless you. And then that goes back to, okay, well, what are the different layers that we have to touch on here that are specific to agentic AI, that are specific to generative AI, that are specific to any AI system? And there we continue to build on top of the principles that were established at the baseline within an organization. But I think what's critical here is there seems to be, these systems are rapidly emerging. I think we've only been looking at some of the challenges in terms of governance associated with generative AI for a very short time span. We're still learning a lot. Generative AI systems are still rapidly developing. But on top of that, we now have this notion of agents. And I think we have to continue to work on what are these best practices, what can or ought they to look like. And here, again, as I mentioned, it's very important to have that multi-stakeholder process by which we can determine that. So we work with a lot of our partners. I specifically run a project right now on AI agents where we're looking at this third level and layer. And everything that we do is working with partners at the very frontier of development of these systems by trying to figure out, okay, what are some of the new areas of risk potentially? How can we mitigate them? How do we even evaluate some of these systems? And what are new areas that we all have to agree on in terms of raising the floor and developing new best practices that can not entirely keep up with development, of course, but ensure that we continuously close this gap so that we know that when we deploy this system, we have tested for XYZ, and that goes back to our underlying principles. We know essentially what it is we're shipping, and we have tested for it to the best standards that are currently out there.
So hearing a little bit about embedding the process ethics into the process of both developing the product and then vetting it before it launches, the importance of stakeholders, and the importance of staying agile, of coming back to the process again and again, because as the technology changes, the processes that we're using internally need to change. Tracy, it looks like you had something you wanted to add.
I just, because I realized I didn't fully you asked about how these change over time. So if I just super fast, I think, what I think we've described is a lot of the ideal. It doesn't mean that I think there's been a lot of things that have shifted over the last number of years and in an increasing way that I just want to touch on briefly, because I think part of what happens is when there is what we're seeing right now, I think you can think of it as an AI arms race, right? So you see this incredible competition. There becomes a lot of pressure to rush to release, and then people tend to try and look for the ethical checklists, and which don't exist. But like, what are the set of things that we can check off as quickly as possible that can rubber stamp this so that we can get it out the door, and then if we have to change things later, we'll do that. And when that happens, when that rush to release happens, then a lot more of the responsibility then falls, on the shoulders of civil society, journalists, researchers who are evaluating these systems once they've been deployed. Common Sense Media is a good example here from a kid's perspective, to then try and hold companies accountable to things that are not going well. And that's a very important role all the time, but it shouldn't be, this should be more in balance than it is currently today, as things are in this current pendulum swing of get it out faster versus take time to evaluate first.
Okay, great, thanks. So in the book that Brian and I worked on, we sort of provided a starter set of principles that companies could use if they hadn't developed theirs, or could look to for guidance as they were amending or updating theirs. And we began with respect for human dignity and rights, and we put it out there for all the reasons that we've talked about and come together today, because human beings, just by their very nature, warrant that respect. So I'm curious to know, and maybe we'll start with you, Benjamin, since you work with a lot of different companies. How much dignity is part of the conversation? Are you talking about it in the organizations that you're connected to? Is it something that comes up?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would not say the word dignity per se. That is not coming up in the conversations that we are having. It would come up if it touches on specific groups and how they, for example, would be affected by technology. We do have working groups on digital trust and so on that are much more specifically targeted at areas that would be directly related to dignity. But I think dignity is a core value that touches on so many other underlying values that are kind of diffused throughout the entire multi-stakeholder process, essentially. And that is when we talk with our partners and we think about what is the downstream impacts of some of these systems, and we bring up real cases and examples, etc., and what it is that we're trying to avoid is essentially negative externalities. And I think that goes back to the question of dignity, because what happens when you have an externality that can diffuse throughout society linked to a specific technological product, that could be related to a loss of dignity, right? And I think that's with everything that we're trying to develop, all of these best practices that I keep on talking about, is exactly to uphold that form of dignity, so that whenever I interact with a technology, with a product as an individual, I can do so and I can retain my dignity and my sense of autonomy with this interaction, knowing that certain boundaries have been respected in that process. And I think that is essentially what we're all trying to optimize for. That's why we have good governance. That's why we care so much about these questions. That is to ensure that this enablement of technology, that's a wave of good, that everybody is lifted, and that dignity is respected in that process.
Great. Jenny, you touched on this briefly already, but tell us a little bit about how it is in Salesforce.
Yeah, I think that we don't use the term dignity within our halls either, but I think it comes out in different ways, in a positive way. The first is the point that I mentioned earlier, which is empowering, right? It's a way to really leverage technology to help empower people to live their fullest. And that, there's the other principle, which is being inclusive, right? this is my personal opinion. I think at some point, some of these technologies, if you're educated or given an opportunity to learn how to use the technology, you should be given access to it, right? Partly because I think there's an inequity perhaps in those who have the technology and those who don't. We're seeing that in just basic internet connection today, right? And there's a lot of effort in government now trying to connect kind of the outer regions, the rural regions of the world, so that they have access, because they're frankly being left out. So there's this idea of dignity that Ro Khanna, which is I think the politician in Cupertino, who he's talked about, that there's dignity in giving people opportunity in this digital society. And if you don't have access to it, you can't benefit from the positives that the technology can provide. So we look at it more from that standpoint, in that like we want to allow the technology to empower those to live their fullest, to live the life they want to live. It actually speaks to the panelists earlier when they're talking about kind of dignity from a standpoint of like being free to talk about to tell your story, right? Nowadays, having the tools so you can tell a story and broadcast it to the world is incredibly powerful. I think learning how to do that in an appropriate way, it is partly our job as a technology company, all companies or organizations, as well as educators, and as well as governments, to educate folks on how to best use the technology for a positive way while mitigating the risks.
Great. And before we hear from you, Tracy, I just want to point out Thor's starting to bring up some questions. If you have questions, feel free to write them on the cards and send them to the ends, because we're going to turn here in just a moment to some of your questions. So Tracy, on this topic.
Yeah, so I think usually the proxy that I've heard for the beautiful word dignity is human rights, or potentially unfair bias or discrimination, right? Like those tend to be ways for organizations that maybe, I guess, feel safer somehow to approach some of these really complex things. Because I think human rights, particularly, you can call on, as we were saying earlier, on the UN Declaration, there are things that feel more tangible somehow than perhaps like approaching dignity as a concept. And so I think that's, certainly a way that this gets approached currently in organizations. I think, what I see now in my current world, in large part because of the focus on kids and teens, it feels, and that it's civil society, there is more discussion of dignity and the rights of children in a different way than there certainly is in the case of Google. But I just want to point out a danger here, because I think we need to always be thinking about who is deciding what dignity is and what dignity matters to whom. And that third player here is always the organization. So, and particularly and yes, I'm coming from a very, U.S. focused perspective here, in the extreme polarized world that we live in now, where there's a lot of questions as to who has rights and who doesn't, or who has all the rights and who has fewer of the rights. I think those are incredibly important to ask. We've already seen OpenAI say that they are going to start presenting more both sides of issues, and that I think can very easily run counter to human dignity if we look at it from a inclusive perspective, which I hope we should. So I think when there are no rules, whether self-imposed by organizations or held, other ways of accountability, if we are not questioning who's deciding what dignity is and for whom, then we may be really missing where harms could be happening more easily and at scale.
Great. So before we turn to audience questions, just another quick pass back to, is there anything that you would put on your wish list or your recommendation for organizations to think about developing AI in ways that better respect human dignity? Anything you'd like to see emerge? And really, anybody who has a thought can chime in.
I think I'm happy to chime in first. I think when it comes to AI technologies, and this is both something that is an enabler, but it's also something that we should be mindful of, is this idea and concept of hyper-personalization and what that means in terms of being able to, all of the content that I see, that I consume, is that pulling me towards the direction of a specific sub-community that I can identify with? Is it pushing me towards an echo chamber? How does hyper-personalization affect how I interact with this technology? How does it affect me and my behavior and my sense of thinking? And put that into in the context from global to local, I think very important to think about how do we associate and how does technology either enable or disable us to associate with different values, ideas, communities, etc. I think it's both an enabler in terms of an enabler in the sense that, well, if technology it knows me and my preferences better, can I then focus on what is of more value to me? Can I optimize my time because I don't have to search through this entire stack of knowledge that I believe is irrelevant to me? But is it also perhaps a limiting factor in terms of, well, there are all of the things that I don't know, maybe to be pleasantly surprised to interact with somebody I otherwise would not have interacted with. And I think that is very critical to continue to have that conversation, especially from the level of local to global. What does it look like outside in our communities today? But also, what does it look like at a global level? How can we relate to each other, and in which part of this process does technology affect or mediate those relationships? I think it's very important to continue to have that conversation, especially as it goes back into this dialogue that we've been having, this conversation surrounding the underlying values at which we judge these systems by.
Thanks. Daniel?
Yeah, I actually wish that we would stop using the term AGI, artificial general intelligence. It feels like a monolithic term in which the technology is going to supersede human intelligence. I personally hope that there's a way to kind of better define the capabilities of the technology in the domains where it's good at and where it's not. I know there's a lot of work trying to benchmark these AI models and measure them, but they're frankly not enough. And then a lot of people are not really paying attention to that because they hear the word AI or AGI, they think that it's going to do everything. And that's why you get into trouble, right? And it's almost a fault that there's a false promise that we're chasing after, perhaps, and just naming the term.
Tracy?
Is this like a genie? Do I get 3 wishes?
Yeah.
Maybe 4. So I think, sort of similar to what Daniel was saying, I get very frustrated with all of the focus on existential risks to humanity, because I think that really can mask the very real risks and harms and opportunities that are happening today, actually now. And so that is one wish, right? That organizations are willing to look more at what's actually happening now with what we're putting out in the world, and act more responsibly from that perspective. I have strong wishes for policy here. I think New York is doing some things. California is doing some interesting things. Colorado's done a couple interesting things. Again, I'm very U.S. centric here. But I think, we need that now. And we know enough to have policy. It's not going to be perfect, but we need to be doing something. And I wish organizations would slow down. I think, that this speed right now is untenable. And I don't think it's serving them as much as well as serving the public. And I think it's very easy, this is my last one, it's very easy right now to think about AI as generative AI. That's not the case. There's a lot of AI technology in the world that is also has opportunity and a lot of risks. But just in the world of generative AI, and of course I'm thinking about things like social AI companions, I don't think we right now have come to grips with how much extraordinarily personal data these organizations have, and what that means if that data is not treated with human dignity, whether intentional or unintentional. I mean, it is so easy for all of us to disclose things that I don't think we would want to have done. So that's my last wish.
Great, thanks. Brian, over to you.
All right. Make sure this is on. Is this on now? Everyone hear me? Okay. So we're getting some great questions. I've batched 3 of them together here, so I'm just gonna read these questions out. First question is just a general comment. There are lots of different kinds of AI. What do we do to actually keep them distinct from each other? It's one thing to talk about AI for a fusion reactor, and another to talk about ChatGPT and other sorts of things like that. So how do we kind of keep the terminology separate? That's the first question. I'm just going to add 2 more that are related to each other. What are some specific ways to sandbox and pressure test to begin to probe these systems? How do you ensure diverse data sets in the system for testing and optimizing without exploiting people's data and breaking trust? So there's actually a couple questions squeezed in there together. And then the next one, what is one thing that has been really successful in your experience in terms of improving the development and deployment of AI systems? And is it transferable to startups? And I can repeat any of those since I dumped a lot on you at once.
I could start to answer that last one.
All right.
I was going to do that. The last one.
I'll be a little more specific. I think you mentioned a little bit, but I want to go into how we actually develop products. When you sit down and ask the question, well, should we build this or not? When you make the decision that the answer is yes. What we try to do at that point, what we do all the time, is to include a diverse group of people who sit down and brainstorm all the implications of the technology. And then what you then do is blow out an entire list of features that are there to aim at achieving the goal of the intended product, as well as mitigating all the risks related to the implications that are the second and third order implications of the technology, right? So now then you have an entire list of features and you prioritize them, and you begin to see, okay, as you develop, you test it and see, did it come out the way you thought it would, right? Because when you create these new technologies, the reason why a lot of AI is still in research is because you actually don't know what's going to come out of it. So as it begins to develop, testing that at a micro level with the product team, then you begin to kind of shift your plans as you learn, right? But towards the kind of the latter stages, we bring in a completely different group of folks who've never seen the technology, and we call this red teaming, and we really just beat the heck out of it. And sometimes it could be half a company trying to red team one feature before it gets released, because what we want to do is to see the diversity of ways people can use it. There's so many technologies or anything, any product, you have no idea how your customers are actually going to use it until they actually use it. So the more like volume and diversity that you bring to the table, the better. And this is fully transferable to anything. Like, it doesn't matter if it's an actual information technology to actual physical goods, right? So yeah, does it transfer to startups? Yeah, having worked at startups, it does work. The question is, how do you actually scale it, right? That's harder. And I think that's where the risk comes, because I think when OpenAI realized they have a significant technology, they decided to release it to the world because they realized they couldn't test it all themselves. And that's the words they use, right? And I'm like, in some ways repeating what they're saying. There's obviously a lot of risk to that, but at the same time, you also have to think, yeah, you know what? There's no way a bunch of, to your point, a bunch of white kids coding and creating models are going to be able to figure out all the different permutations in which the technology could be used or abused, right? So I think that's the challenging part. I don't think that's solved yet.
I think maybe on the point of sandboxes and building on what you're saying, Daniel. So this idea of having, we have so many technologies moving at such a rapid pace right now. Tracy, you were saying before that maybe we should slow things down a bit. I think, well, the idea of sandboxes at the very frontier of testing and evaluation, to conduct that testing across the public and the private sector, to figure out, okay, we have this potentially path departing new technology, the new system that we want to put into use in terms of public healthcare, for example. But existing regulations, they would obviously not allow for it, and perhaps for very good reasons. But how do we test together across this public and private dichotomy? How do we figure out, well, what this system or this solution, the potential benefits it's having? Let's put that into a sealed off environment. Let's try to test it. Let's figure out, what are the limits? And again, you mentioned before, Daniel, you can have half a company essentially red teaming a solution. But what are other ways in which we can, before a system, a new tool is deployed to the market, what are other ways in which we can test? And I think sandboxes is a great example. I would love to see that kind of gain much more prominence out there in terms of internationally. Singapore is doing great work on this, and others are doing excellent work too. But to really have these closed-off environments where you can collaborate, where you can test, where you can innovate together with the public sector to also realize, well, where systems, they butt heads against existing regulations. Is that because the system is essentially overriding some of the regulations? Is it because of other insufficiencies? And how can we build the technology around that? How can we help regulators also update some of these regulations? And a lot of the regulations that we are facing in many critical sectors as well has been developed in context where we didn't have this technology. So I think there's enough reason to have that dialogue, and I think sandboxes is a great opportunity to have that.
Okay, I'll try and tackle the first question and then add a quick thing on the third. So there are a number of different ways that technologists describe different types of AI technology, and I'm going to focus on machine learning here. I think I tend to use them synonymously. There's lots of arguments about that, but in terms of today, I think we can focus on machine learning. But I'm actually going to try and do this in the context of people using it who are not building it. I think there's really three types of technology, of AI technology. There's AI that you interact with that you may not know you're interacting with. So there's lots of things that happen on your phone every single day. Or a good example here is like your Netflix recommendations or whatever you're interacting with that all the time, whether or not you're aware of it. There's AI that is imposed on you that you also may not be aware of. So deciding what your credit rating is, or whether you get an interview or not, right? All of those things are things that you are not interacting with, but that technology is imposing itself in some form or fashion. And then there's AI that is sort of, you can think of as like co-creators, right? So the generative AI is always creating a novel new thing every time you interact with it that is new content. Whether or not, Shannon would argue it's not really new because it's all the AI mirror, and that's very true, but it is novel responses, right, which is very distinct from those other forms of technology. I don't know if that's really what the questioner wanted, but I think, and then what I'll say on the third one is alongside what these folks are saying is that the thing I think I've seen that is the most successful is process and adhering to process, even when it's not what people want. So where I've seen things go poorly is when there is a very thorough process for these. This is how we do responsible AI evaluations. These are the steps we take, and this is what happens when we flag something that might need another look or whatever it may be. When particularly people in power then think, I don't actually want that step to happen, so we're going to skip that step this time. That's when I think there can be a lot of problems. There has to be commitment not only to those values, but to the process that's operationalizing them.
There's one thing I want to add. There's a bunch of researchers led by the folks at Anthropic, one of the AI labs. They're trying to really fully understand what's happening inside these large language models. currently, frankly, don't know like how the emergent behaviors that are coming out of these models. So their approach to trying to solve this is through this idea of mechanistic interpretability, to understand exactly the calculations that every layers of these AI models, what the calculations are actually doing and how it comes up with the answers that it does. And there's some hope in here because I think that they wrote this paper called The Biology of an LLM, and you can look it up, and it's fascinating. It begins to kind of dig into the math and what's happening. If we fully understand these models, there's a chance perhaps to kind of change and make them more accurate. Now, maybe not, but at least we understand it. But right now, we actually don't know how it comes up with the answers they do, right? So there's a lot of scientific work on this idea of mechanistic interpretability. So I would pour effort into that.
There's a key in there too, which is that it's not magic. It's AI, it's fancy math, right? And I mean, math is magical, but it is understandable even if we don't understand all of it yet, right? And I think that's incredibly important to remember that it's math. It's not some unknown force.
All right, that's fantastic. We got a couple of questions here related to responsibility and how situations can kind of change depending on leadership. You talked a little bit about, Tracy, you were just talking about bad leaders can really ruin things.
Your words, not mine.
Well, they can, I mean. So here's one. Should executives of companies building AI systems be held ethically and morally responsible for the economic and societal disruption those systems cause? That's one. Related to this, but perhaps slightly different, what happens to ethical use councils, and I'm actually going to broaden this question, what happens to basically how ethics operates in a company when employees start losing their power, when the job market shifts in such a way that they're not as powerful as they used to be? And this, I've been having conversations with folks about this recently, saying that once the job market changed, then it kind of shifted power away from employees and back towards the companies, and that was perhaps one of the reasons that things have not been going as well recently. And any thoughts on these two things, whether it's about leadership responsibility or the shifting power between companies and their employees?
I'll answer the first one. Yes.
All right. You want to elaborate?
I think there absolutely needs to be accountability. And I think there should be accountability that impacts an organization. And I think there needs to, look, if you take this out of the context of AI, if a leader makes bad decisions that impact a company's ability to operate, that leader is held accountable for those decisions. This is not different.
Thank you. Other thoughts, Daniel, Benjamin?
Yeah, I think that the accountability, absolutely. The question around responsibility, I think that's trickier because I think the challenge around this time is that the responsibility now is shifting in different ways because of the technology. Yeah. Right? The fact that the AI models are trained on the corpus of internet data that we have all contributed to, right? And now there are some companies that have benefited from that than others, but at the end of the day, as Chan has mentioned, it's a mirror of human society in some ways. It's a skewed view, right? So recognizing that, that's important. Now, I think when we talk about organizational responsibility, what is an organization? It's just a bunch of people. Yes, there are constructs and myths that we've created as humans so that we can organize ourselves into an organization, but each individual has responsibility as well. So one thing that we're beginning to discuss within Salesforce is that individuals have individual responsibility about learning technology, how you use it, and it needs to align to the values and the laws in which you're governed, right? It can't just be that it's just the leader, because the leader itself sets the direction, sets the culture, but they can't tell the employees at the end of the day how they behave day to day. They're going to do their own thing, there's some agency in that. So I think that we're trying to impart on that. That is everyone's responsibility. So that's why it's not that clear that it's that absolutely is the leader, right? There's accountability, but is it the leader's responsibility? Yes, they have some, but not all. Individuals do as well.
That's true.
And do you want to step in on this one?
I think that I actually was going to say mic drop to Daniel. I think that was a good place to leave it in terms of the distinction between being accountable. Someone has to be ultimately answerable for what's going on in these organizations and the choices that are being made. But we know from the work we've done, Brian, part of which we did in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and the companies that we work with at the Markkula Center, is the responsibility needs to be integrated in the organization and shared broadly in order for it to have a shot at actually having a good outcome.
All right.
All right, well, so I want to thank everybody, and in particular Tracy for pinch hitting at the last minute, but it was great to have the time to prepare with Benjamin and Daniel, and we're so grateful for your perspective. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you.